The Battle of Fromelles was a British military operation on the Western Front during World War I, subsidiary to the Battle of the Somme. General headquarters of the British Expeditionary Force had ordered the First Army and Second Army to prepare attacks to support the Fourth Army on the Somme 80 kilometers to the south, to exploit any weakening of the German defences opposite. The attack took place 16 kilometers from Lille, between the Fauquisart-Trivelet Road and Cordonnery Farm, an area overlooked from Aubers Ridge to the south. The ground was low-lying and much of the defensive fortification of both sides consisted of breastworks, rather than trenches. The operation was conducted by 11th Corps of the 1st Army with the 61st Division and the 5th Australian Division, Australian Imperial Force against the 6th Bavarian Reserve Division, supported by two flanking divisions of the German 6th Army. Preparations for the attack were rushed. The troops involved lacked experience in trench warfare and the power of the German defense was significantly underestimated, the attackers being outnumbered 2-1. The advance took place in daylight, against defenses overlooked by Aubers Ridge, on a narrow front which left German artillery on either side free to fire into the flanks of the attack. A renewal of the attack by the 61st Division early on 20 July was cancelled, after it was realized that German counterattacks had already forced a retirement by the Australian troops to the original front line. On 19 July, General von Falkenhayn, the German chief of the General Staff, had judged the British attack to be a long-anticipated offensive against the 6th Army. On the next day, when the effect of the attack was known and a captured operation order from 11th Corps revealed the limited intent of the operation, Falkenhayn ordered the Guard Reserve Corps to be withdrawn to reinforce the Somme front. The Battle of Fromelles had inflicted some losses on the German defenders but gained no ground nor deflected many German troops bound for the Somme. The attack was the acute BUT of the AAIF on the Western Front, and the Australian War Memorial described the battle as the worst 24 hours in Australia's entire history. Of 7,080 Belgian francs casualties, 5,533 losses were incurred by the 5th Australian Division. German losses were 1,600–2,000, with 150 taken prisoner. Background: the course of the Battle of the Somme had led the British GHQ on 5 July to inform the commanders of the three other British armies that the German defences from the Somme north to the Ancre River might soon fall. The 1st and 2nd Army commanders were required to choose places to penetrate the German defences. If the attacks on the Somme continued to make progress, any gaps made were then to be widened, to exploit the weakness and disorganization of the German defense. The 2nd Army commander, General H. Plumer, was occupied by preparations for an offensive at Messines Ridge but could spare one division for a joint attack with the 1st Army at the Army boundary. On 8 July, the 1st Army Commander General Charles Munro ordered the 9th Corps Commander Lieutenant General Richard Haking to plan a two-division attack. Haking proposed to capture Aubers Ridge, Aubers and Fromelles, but next day Munro dropped Aubers Ridge from the attack, as he and Plumer had concluded that with the troops available, no great objective could be achieved. On 13 July, after receiving intelligence reports that the Germans had withdrawn approximately 9 infantry battalions from the Lille area from 9 to 12 July, GHQ informed the two army commanders that a local attack was to be carried out at the army boundary around the 18th of July, to exploit the depletion of the German units in the vicinity. Haking was ordered to begin a preliminary bombardment, intended to appear to be part of a large offensive, while limiting an infantry attack to the German front line. On 16 July, discussions about the attack resumed, as the need for diversions to coincide with operations on the Somme had diminished when a big victory of Bazentin Ridge had not led to a general German collapse. Sir Douglas Haig, the commander-in-chief of the BEF, did not want the attack to take place unless the local commanders were confident of success, and Monroe and Haking opposed postponement or cancellation of the attack. The weather had been dull on the 15th of July and rain began next day. Soon after, Monroe and Haking made the decision to proceed with the attack. 0 hour for the main bombardment was then postponed because of the weather, and at 8:30 a.m., Haking delayed the attack for at least 24 hours. After considering cancellation, Monroe postponed the attack to the 19th of July. Prelude. British offensive preparations. The Second Army provided the 5th Australian Division, the artillery of the 4th Australian Division, and heavy guns and trench mortars to 11th Corps, to participate in an attack from the Fauquisart-Trivelet Road to La Boutillière with the 31st Division and 61st Division. A shortage of artillery and the lack of training and experience in the Australian divisional artilleries and some of the heavy batteries led to the attack front being reduced to 4,000 yards between the Fauquisart-Trivelet Road and Delangre Farm. The ground to be attacked was waterlogged, flat and easily overlooked from Ober's Ridge, behind the German front line to the south. The 39th Division and 31st Division moved their boundaries north as the 61st Division concentrated along its attack front from the Fauquisart-Trivelet Road to Bond Street. The 20th Division moved its boundary south to Cordonnery Farm to take over the left of the 5th Australian Division, which concentrated the divisional frontage from Cordonnery Farm to Bond Street. The 12 attacking battalions were supported by more artillery than at Ober's Ridge in May 1915, when a similar number of battalions attacked in the same area. More ammunition was available than in 1915, and trench mortars were added to the artillery for wire cutting. With support from 1st Army Artillery to the south, 296 field guns and 78 heavy guns were ready, which gave a greater concentration of heavy artillery than that of the 4th Army on the first day of the Somme. After several postponements for weather, on the 18th of July visibility increased and the artillery bombardment proceeded. The bombardment of the German front at La Bassée was repeated and provoked retaliation from the German artillery. Overnight British infantry patrols reported that no movement was visible in the German lines, which appeared to be weakly held. German covering parties stopped Australian raiders on the right flank of the 5th Australian Division front, where the wire appeared to be intact except for gaps on the left. The 19th of July began hazy, but the time of the artillery 0 hour was fixed for 11 a.m., ready for the infantry attack to begin at 6 p.m. A special heavy artillery bombardment began on the Sugarloaf at 2:35 p.m., by which time a German counter-bombardment was falling on all of the attack front, causing casualties to the Australians and the field artillery crews of the 61st Division at Route Tilleloy. Several ammunition dumps were exploded and the decoy lifts by the British artillery failed to deceive the Germans. The Australian and British infantry began to move into no man's land at 5:30 p.m. British plan of attack. The German salient at Fromelles contained some higher ground facing northwest, known as the Sugarloaf. The small size and height of the salient gave the Germans observation of no man's land on either flank. The Australian 5th Division, under Major General J.W. Mackay, was to attack the left flank of the salient by advancing south as the 61st Division attacked the right flank from the west. Each division was to attack with its 3 brigades in line, with 2 battalions from each brigade in the attack and the other 2 in reserve, ready to take over captured ground or to advance further. Haking issued the attack orders on the 14th of July, when wire cutting began along the 11th Corps front. It was intended that the bombardment would inflict mass casualties on the German infantry, reducing them to a state of collapse. The British infantry were to assemble as close to the German lines as possible, no man's land being 100 to 400 yards wide. Before the British artillery fire was lifted from the front line, then the infantry would rush the surviving Germans while they were disorganized. advancing to the German second line. The main bombardment was to begin at midnight on 17/18 July for 7 hours. Over the final 3 hours the artillery was to lift and the infantry show bayonets and dummy figures several times, to simulate an infantry advance, and then the artillery was to resume bombardment of the front line, to catch the German infantry out of cover. German defensive preparations. Von Falkenhayn had ordered a construction program on the Western Front in January 1915, to make it capable of being defended indefinitely by a small force against superior numbers. A more elaborate and fortified front line was built with fields of barbed wire and carefully sighted and camouflaged concrete machine gun nests, with another trench close behind to shelter the trench garrison, during bombardment of the front line, to evade Allied long-range artillery fire, intended to obstruct the movement of reinforcements from the new rear defenses. Communication trenches were built. The front line was to be held at all costs as the main line of resistance, but in May 1915 Falkenhayn ordered a reserve line to be built along all of the Western Front, 2,000–3,000 yards behind the front line, out of range of enemy field artillery, to contain any breakthrough and be occupied opposite a sector broken in two, as jumping-off points by counter-attacking troops. If counter-attacks failed to recover the front line, the rear position could be connected to the uncaptured parts of the front line on either side. The construction program was a huge undertaking, which took until autumn 1915 and had several opponents, notably the 6th Army commander Crown Prince Ruprecht, who claimed that a rear line would undermine the determination of soldiers to stand their ground. The front of the 6th Army had been quiet since the Battle of Loos. In July 1916 the 6th Bavarian Reserve Division held a 4.5-mile stretch of the front line with 4 regiments, from east of Obers village, north to a point near Bois Grenier, each regiment having 1 battalion in the front line, 1 in support and 1 in reserve. On one regimental front there were 75 shelters with 9 to 12 inches of concrete protection. After a British gas attack late on 15 July opposite Neuve-Chapelle and Forquessart, German artillery bombarded the British front line, and a raid by 100 troops of Bavarian Reserve Regiment 21 on the Australian lines caused nearly 100 casualties and took 3 prisoners for a loss of 32 casualties.